Hi, I'm Leif from 824 Workshop. Today I'm going to walk you through the step-by-step process of replacing the front brakes and rotors on this 2011 Chevy Malibu. I'm going to show you the driver's side. The passenger side will be the same procedure. Tools you'll need are a set of brakes and rotors, brake cleaner and grease, jack and jack stands, 14, 17, and 19 millimeter sockets, wrenches with a pipe or a breaker bar, a flathead screwdriver, a brake caliper wind back tool set, a wire brush, and a torque wrench. Start out by using your 19 millimeter socket and loosen the plastic covers and then remove the wheel cover. Here you will see I am using air tools. If you do not have the benefit of air tools, you will want to loosen the lug nuts with a 19 millimeter socket and a breaker bar while the car is still on the ground. Then once the lug nuts are loosened, raise and support your vehicle with a jack and jack stands. Once the vehicle is raised and supported, then finish removing the tire. Next, working with the vehicle, you're going to want to turn your steering wheel and turn the steering knuckle to make it easier to reach the back of the caliper. Now that we have easier access to the caliper, first thing to do is take a pretty good sized screwdriver and place it in the hole you see in the caliper. Wedge the screwdriver in the rotor and pry the screwdriver towards you, placing pressure on the cylinder itself, pushing the cylinder back into the caliper just a little. This is to make it easier to remove the caliper after you remove the bolts. Next, remove the two caliper bolts. These bolts are 14 millimeter. These two bolts should come out pretty easy. After the two bolts are removed, take a bungee cord and run it through the two holes in the bracket and run it up through your strut. You do this because you do not want your caliper hanging on your brake line. This is to help support the weight of your caliper so that you don't cause any damage to the brake line. Now that your caliper is out of the way, we need to remove the caliper bracket. This is being held on by two 17 millimeter bolts. These two bolts will be on tighter than the last two you removed. So I'm going to use the ratchet and a piece of pipe, but you can also use a breaker bar if you'd like. The piece of pipe is just to give you extra leverage and to make it easier to remove. After removing the caliper bracket, your rotor will pull right off. Once everything is disassembled, we can begin to prep everything for reassembly. First, take your rotor and just spray a little brake cleaner on the rotor. This brake cleaner is used to remove the oil on the rotor that is placed there from the factory to keep the rotor from rusting while it sits on a shelf. You want to remove the oil before placing your brake pads against it. Again, spray down the rotor. Take a shop rag or towel and simply wipe down the rotor. Next, we are going to prep our brake caliper bracket. First, take reference of where the scratch indicator is on one of your brake pads before removing. That's a little piece of metal on one of the corners of your pads. Remove the pads from the caliper. Most of the time they will slide out rather easily. If one is sticking a little and will not move by hand, simply take a rubber mallet or hammer and lightly tap on one of the brake pads and it will come out. You will then see two metal clips that help hold the brake pads in place. Again, remove by hand or simply use a flathead screwdriver to pry them out. you will have new ones to replace these. Once they are removed, take your wire brush and clean up both ends of the caliper bracket. You do this to remove any brake dust buildup or rust so the new clips can set in the caliper bracket properly. Take a very small amount of grease and put it on the caliper bracket where the metal clips set in. Then put in your new metal clips that came with your brake pads. The caliper bracket also has two guide pins that allow the caliper and brakes to adjust and wear evenly. Remove both of these guide pins and grease them thoroughly. I recommend removing the rubber boot, adding grease, and then placing the rubber boot back on, greasing the guide pin again, and then placing it back into the bracket. Do this one at a time so not to mess up which guide pin goes where, because sometimes they do differ a little. Take the caliper bracket and put just a little bit of grease on the new metal clips you placed in the bracket. Take the brake pads and place a scratch indicator on one of the pads. Make sure to place the indicator on the pad so when the brake pads are placed onto the caliper bracket, it will end up in the same spot as it did with the old brake pads. You place a scratch indicator onto your brake pad by simply looking at the corners of the metal. You will see little slotted areas where you can simply slide the indicator on. This scratch indicator is important because it will let you know when your brake pads are getting worn out and should be replaced. Lastly, slide the brake pads onto the caliper bracket into the metal clip. The caliper bracket and the rotor are now cleaned off and ready to reassemble on the vehicle. First, take the rotor and place it back onto the wheel hub. Then take your caliper bracket and slide it back into place. Line up the holes and thread the 17mm bolts back in by hand to start. Once both bolts are started and tightened down by hand, take your 17mm socket and wrench and tighten both bolts down tight. When that is completed, you need to push the piston back into the caliper so you have enough room to get the caliper on the new brake pads. For this you will need a wind back brake caliper tool set. Take the wind back tool and place it into the caliper as you see in the video. Slowly apply pressure by turning the handle of the tool, pushing the piston back into the caliper. When the piston is fully pressed back into the caliper, then turn the wind back tool the opposite direction and remove the pressure. You will then be able to remove the tool from the caliper. Once the piston is fully pushed back into the caliper, remove the bungee cord from the caliper and the strut. Make sure to remove the bungee cord from the vehicle. Slide the caliper over the brake pads back onto the bracket. Again, lining up the holes, then take your 14mm bolts and start threading them in by hand. Once hand tight, take your 14mm socket and wrench and tighten both bolts down. Take your steering wheel and straighten out the steering knuckle. Take your tire and place it back on the wheel hub. Take the lug nuts and place them on by hand. Once on by hand, use a star pattern while tightening down the lug nuts with a 19mm socket. Once tightened down by an air tool or hand ratchet, lower the vehicle to the floor. Once on the floor, take a torque wrench with a 19mm socket and torque the lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Then take the plastic wheel cover, making sure to line up the hole for the valve stem and tighten it down by hand using the 19mm socket. Once all the brakes are done that you are planning to do for the day, before you drive the vehicle, make sure to pump your brake pedal multiple times until you feel your brake pressure build back up in the brake pedal. You do this to reset your caliper pistons. I hope this video helps you out. Again, I'm Leif from A24 Workshop. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and share on your social media platforms to help the channel grow. Thank you.